Hello and welcome to Volt Holocron. I'm Jonathan and I'm sure you remember the exciting pod racing sequence in the Phantom Menace. Well, today I'm going to cover every canon pod racer from that race, so let's get right into it. To start, I'm looking into the mean and ruthless Sebulba. Sebulba was a Dug from the mid-rim planet Malastare. Sebulba used an orange pod racer which he'd modified so that he could cheat in races. His racer had ion disruptors, magna spikes, and 2 flamethrowers, making him a dangerous opponent. Despite his cheating, Sebulba was still a skilled pilot, and he was the favourite to win the race in the Boonta Eve Classic in the Phantom Menace. He also had 2 Twilight twin slaves, called An Jella and Tan Jella. In one race on Tatooine, before the one we saw in the Phantom Menace, Sebulba was racing against Anakin, who was catching up to Sebulba. To combat this, he used one of his flamethrowers, making Anakin crash. After this event, and after the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, Sebulba carried on racing, having rebuilt or replaced his pod racer, which was destroyed in the Phantom Menace. Posters could be seen of Sebulba during the Clone Wars, advertising the showdown between him and his biggest rival, Ben Quadineros. The pair were even considered to be the sport's greatest rivalry. Later in his career, Sebulba switched paths away from pod racing and onto battle racing. In this sport, he piloted a ship called the Widowmaker. Around this time, Sebulba got involved with a group of pirates who were robbing the Rebel Alliance supply lines. Now obviously, this attracted the attention of the rebels, who not long after defeating the Empire, hoped to get information out of Sebulba, finding him at one of his races. However, Lando was the man hoping to talk to Sebulba, and so they went for the unorthodox approach of participating in the battle race in the Millennium Falcon. Lando disguised himself under the name Rizzo Landian and disguised Chewie as Crunchy. While Sebulba, Lando, and the other contestants were participating in this race, an Imperial Star Destroyer came out of lightspeed, ordering everyone to surrender. This is when Lando revealed himself, asking that all battle racers come together to chase away the Imperial ship. Sebulba actually agreed to this plan despite not wanting to work with Lando, and took up the call sign Gold 4. The plan worked and the Star Destroyer left, allowing for Lando to chat with Sebulba about the anti-alliance pirates. Sebulba refused at first, trying to rally the other participants against Lando, but after seeing that they weren't going to stand with him, Sebulba stood down and gave up information on the pirates. Next up, I'm covering the rival to Sebulba, Ben Quadineros. Ben Quadineros was a Toon from the Outer Rim planet Tund. Quadineros used the rented BT-310 Quadra, which was his chosen vehicle for races. The one which he used in the Phantom Menace was built poorly, which combined with it being damaged by Ark Roos, who was trying to sabotage Anakin's pod, meant that when we saw him in the Phantom Menace, the power coupling shorted out, causing the engine to malfunction, leading to Quadineros hitting the screen on the pod racer, accidentally causing the ship's energy binders to turn off, meaning that the engines detached and flew away, causing him to never leave the start line. His experience here was an unfortunate start to his pod racing career, especially as he was a famous pod racer on his home planet, due to his skill on amateur circuits, which meant that people were quite excited for his debut into professional racing. This didn't stop him renting BT-310 Quadras again though, as in the poster I mentioned previously, advertising a race between Sebulba and Quadineros, he was pictured with a BT-310 Quadra. In his career, Quadineros even managed to win the Boonta Eve Classic at some point. Now I'm covering Rat Tyrell. Rat Tyrell was an Alina from the mid-rim planet Aline. Tyrell used a large podracer which had 2 large engines and was painted blue and red. Before the Boonta Eve podrace we saw in the Phantom Menace, Tyrell was having a good career as a podracer, sometimes being regarded as being Aline's most famous native. Tyrell travelled in his career alongside his family, who was sadly there on Tatooine when he died. Speaking of his death, Tyrell died crashing into stalactites as seen in the Phantom Menace. This was because his accelerator jammed while he was distracted with a competitor, and due to this, he was left powerless to avoid crashing into them. Additionally, even if Tyrell had survived in the Laguna Caves, he wouldn't have been rescued, as rescue teams wouldn't go in there due to the crate dragons that lived there. Despite dying, Tyrell left behind a great legacy with his son, Deland Tyrell, who started up the Rat Tyrell Foundation, which aimed to expose the dangers of pod racing and the criminal behaviour that surrounded it. This foundation was actually quite successful, as after much campaigning and some cases of racers being arrested, the sport was outlawed in the core worlds, and viewership dropped by over half. Next up, I'm covering Dud Bolt. Dud Bolt was a Volpterine from the deep core planet Volpter. Bolt used a Volpterine 327 podracer, which was painted red in some places. Interestingly, as well as being a podracer, Bolt was also a hitman, which I guess aided him in the ruthlessness of the pod racing sport. As well as this, he also served as Sebulba's mid-air bodyguard. In the Phantom Menace, he managed to reach lap 3 of the race, but never reached the finish line, instead crashing into Ark Ruse, and therefore needing to be taken to the Mos Espa Med Center. This failed race didn't stop Dud Bolt from racing again though, as in Attack of the Clones, live footage of him racing could be seen in the Outlander Club, which Anakin and Kenobi had chased Zam Wesell into. Now I'm covering Gasgano. Gasgano was a Zetsto from the Outer Rim planet Troikon. He used a green-ooled Pedrovia, which had a camera on the back, allowing Gasgano to monitor any racers behind him, ensuring that they wouldn't be able to pass. Gasgano actually had another advantage over other racers as well, as he had 4 arms and so could operate his pod racer easier. He was also very competitive, hoping to take down Sebulba, taking first place in the Boonta Eve Classic. As we saw in the Phantom Menace though, this didn't work out as planned, with Skywalker taking first place after causing Sebulba to crash. Gasgano did get second though. Next up, I'm covering Odi Mandrell. Odi Mandrell was an Kit from the Outer Rim planet Tatooine. Mandrell used a silver and red pod racer, which he maintained using pit droids. These pit droids actually became so good at their job that they broke several pod racing records. Mandrell participated in pod racing due to loving the thrill and excitement of the sport, and this led to him participating in the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace. As shown in the Phantom Menace, this didn't go well for him though, as in the race he made a pit stop, which ended up ruining his race. While he was stopped, one of the pit droids stood in front of the engine, while trying to approach another pit droid, which it was annoyed at, and so it got sucked into the engine, destroying the engine, but luckily, the pit droid survived the experience. Obviously, Mandrell couldn't race without that engine, and so he never finished the race. Now I'm covering Teemto Pagales. Teemto Pagales was a Vecnoid from Muna's Mandel in the Mid-Rim, which he was actually an outcast of. Pagales used an IPG X1131 Longtail pod racer, which was coloured orange, white and cyan. As seen in the Phantom Menace, he participated in the Boonta Eve Classic alongside Anakin Skywalker, where one of his engines was shot down on lap 2 by a Tusken Raider, causing him to crash.
I don't care what universe you're from, that's gotta hurt.
Luckily, he actually survived this crash, and even went on to race in other races. Next up, I'm covering the devious and skillful Eldar Beedo. Eldar Beedo was a Glimfid from Pluto. Beedo used a podracer with Manta Ram Air Mark IV flat-twin turbojet engines, which was coloured blue and red. In the Phantom Menace, he moved up and down the positions quite a lot, but in the end he managed not to crash, finishing in 3rd place. Now I'm covering Morhonic. Morhonic was a Gran from Hock, located in the colonies. He used a green podracer with black and yellow throughout the design. As seen in the Phantom Menace, he participated in the Boonta Eve Classic alongside Anakin Skywalker, and in this race he and Sebulba were ramming into each other until Morhonic was pushed into a cliff, which resulted in him crashing. It's unknown to whether he survived or not though. Next up, I'm covering Bowls Roar. Bowls Roar was a Sneevil from Sneeve in the mid-rim. Roar flew this podracer. He was also a regular to the Boonta Eve Classic, having won twice before the race in the Phantom Menace. Speaking of that race, Roar was one of the lucky racers which managed to finish, coming in 6th place. He also continued racing after this, with his podracer being seen on screen in the Outlander Club in Attack of the Clones. Now I'm covering the aggressive Ark Roos, who also went by the name Bumpy. Ark Roos was a Nucknog from Sump in the Outer Rim. Roos used a Plug 8G 927 cluster array podracer. Before the race seen in the Phantom Menace, he tried to sabotage Anakin's podracer, but accidentally damaged Ben Quadinero's racer instead. Despite his malpractice, Roos still failed to finish the race, crashing into Dud Bolt in the 3rd lap of the race. Ark Roos was later mentioned in an artist's journal, which was displayed in the Graph archive. Next up, I'm covering Never Key. Never Key was a Zamster from Zagabar in the Outer Rim. Key used a unique purple and blue podracer, which had the cockpit in front of the engines, and had secret modifications which he didn't tell anyone about. Never Key participated in the Boonta Eve Classic race seen in the Phantom Menace, and there's actually an interesting story around him in this race. You see, in the 2nd lap, Key went off course in search of a shortcut, and he never returned. After the race, a police officer called Tanevos Exantor Devo found a hologram of Jabba paying Aura Singh near the crash site of Key's racer, and some henchmen pulling Key out of the pod, but the authenticity of this recording was unclear. This police officer theorized that the company that produced Key's podracer had hired Aura Singh to take out Key, so that they could uncover the secret modifications of the podracer. Now I'm covering Mars Guro. Mars Guro was a Bardotan from Fu, located in the colonies. Guro used a yellow and silver podracer. In the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, Guro crashed on the 2nd lap after Sebulba threw a piece of scrap into his engine. Next, I'm covering Clegg Holdfast. Clegg Holdfast was a Nosorian from New Plimto in the Core Worlds. Holdfast used a Voltec KT-9 Wasp podracer, which was grey and red. As well as being a podracer, Holdfast was also a journalist, and just before the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, he searched for dirty news in the cantina of the Mos Espa Grand Arena's hangar. Now I'm covering Ebe Endicott. Ebe Endicott was a Triffian from the planet Triffis. Endicott used a light blue podracer, coloured orange in some places. In the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, he came 4th. Next up, I'm covering Elan Mac. Elan Mac was a Flugrian from Plu 4. Mac used a brownish-orange Podracer. In the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, he came 5th. Now I'm covering Wan Sandage. Wan Sandage was a Devlik from Red Armor in the Outer Rim. He used the light grey Podracer. Finally, there was Anakin Skywalker. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain who this one is. However, I would like to briefly mention another racer who is said to have been in the Boonta Eve Classic race we saw in the Phantom Menace, despite not being seen in the movie, and many sources saying there are only 18 racers. This racer is Zelbri, and they've only been mentioned in one source, which is the Star Wars Super Graphic, a visual guide to a galaxy far, far away. So yeah, I'm not sure if this racer counts as canon or not. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we hope to see you later at Volt Holocron.